production keeps prices down far more effectively.
As long as suffering of sentient beings remain, I will remain in order to serve.
I imagined God like my grandfather.
In conversation this evening, my guest is a man of science, and like most scientists, he's a philosopher too. As a child, he was fascinated with mathematics and Sanskrit. He's made important contributions in the areas of theoretical physics, astrophysics, and astronomy. He is the head of the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. I'm delighted to welcome Jayant Narlikar. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
You have been writing for some time and more actively recently on the dialogue, or shall we say the meeting ground, or the lack of it between science and religion. What prompted a scientist to begin to think and look at religion?
Well, when I was a young scientist, at the time I used to read something by Einstein or others, and Krishnamurti and so on. So at that time I used to brush aside those ideas on science and religion, thinking that my sole interest is in research, my immediate research problem. But I think as one gets older, the perspective changes, maybe it widens. So some issues which I consider are not part of science but are about science, they begin to bother you.
Why is it then that when a scientist becomes older, as you've said, that these ideas begin to come up for you? Is it because you confront your mortality, or is it just greater wisdom?
I don't think it has to do with that you have very little time left now or do something. It's not like that. But as you work in science, your perspective changes because you get to know more and more ideas. Initially you only have your own idea, then you start listening to others, you have controversies, you have discussions, so the perspective begins to widen. And when you are looking at a wider canvas of science, then some of the issues which in my opinion are outside the canvas, they begin to creep into your mind. And
what are some of these issues that have come up for you?
Well, especially when you are doing astronomy, you realize that you are working with laws of science which people have discovered in the Earth or terrestrial laboratory. These are very restricted premises, if I may use the word, not just the walls of the laboratory but the entire Earth. It's so tiny compared to the whole universe, and you are trying to apply the same laws to the sun, to the galaxy, to the whole gamut of things. And the fact that they seem to work, it begins to bother you in some way. Why do they work? Is there some wider symmetry about the thing? If so, why is the symmetry? Now these are about the working of science, and therefore I consider that they transcend science itself and raise issues like this, why there are basic laws at all. And
but in a sense, doesn't that reinforce the mechanistic view of the universe? You know, that you have these laws, and now of course you have chaos theory, which even seeks to predict, in a sense, what happens in chaos.
Yes.
And when you extrapolate this to the universe, doesn't it reinforce, in fact, the fact that it's all mechanistic and predictable?
Well, one thing which quantum theory tells you is that not everything is predictable. You can have a probabilistic universe where you do not know which of the many routes a certain development will take place. Similarly, chaos tells you that two systems may look very similar at one time, but as they evolve they may look widely different. You cannot tell just because they happen to be very close to each other. Sometimes I give the example of twins. They may be born together and they have similar properties, but if they run into different environments, they may have very different lives. So there are issues which warn you not to expect everything to be predictable given all the initial data. And one of the problems which Einstein had was in confronting with this kind of reality. He felt this can't be so. This famous remark that God doesn't play dice was his conviction that it's not that the universe is probabilistic, it's because we don't know enough about it, so we feel that way.
You know, much of your work has been in cosmology, astronomy, and you have, in a sense, with this, been in opposed to the Big Bang theory, and felt that that is not a valid way of looking at the universe. How does that reconcile with religious beliefs?
Well, I personally don't have very strong or firm religious beliefs with which I would like to test a scientific hypothesis like Big Bang. But generally what I find is, looking at some of my colleagues and very distinguished ones, the local culture does matter. And if you have been brought up in an environment which tells you that God created the universe and then everything came out of it.
And that was when the Big Bang happened.
And so when you find that the Big Bang theory says exactly the same thing, you give it an immediate acceptance. Now, perhaps I am subtly influenced by culture which tells me that there is no such thing as a beginning, no such thing as an end. So an idea of a universe without a beginning, without an end, perhaps appeals to me for that reason. But that is what I would call a non-scientific assessment of the situation. One can be purely objective and say, here is Big Bang, here is some alternative idea. Let us test it in terms of observations. And I feel that even on those very dry issues of observations, you find that Big Bang does not come up to, I think, to a successful theory. There are many examples. For instance, if you take the age of the universe, if the universe started with a Big Bang, how old is it? The calculation tells you about 10 billion years. Now that looks very long, but there are stars which are 15, 18 billion years old. So there is an obvious contradiction. So there are issues like this which come in.
You had mentioned objectivity. Is science inherently objective?
Yes, the science per se is objective.
But scientists
may not be, because scientist is a human being, and as I just mentioned, there are cultural influences which do form part of the total psyche which looks at science.
In some ways, both religion and science seek to access truth, reality, albeit the truth and reality in different contexts and different facets. So why are we sort of frequently either romanticizing the commonality between science and spirituality, or the fact that they are contradictory in some ways?
Well, I don't think one should stress these issues too much, because we know very little, in my opinion, about the total truth through the means of science and also through the medium of religion. So we are essentially illiterate in terms of both, and from what little we know, we are trying to see whether there is a commonality. So there may or may not be, so one need not get disturbed by it, but it always helps to see, to use what I would call complementary methods to search for truth, because we don't have it yet. So that's, in that sense, I encourage these dialogues or debates.
In what ways would you say that science and religion how do they differ in the ways they look at truth?
Well, the method of science is the following, that when an event is perceived, that event may be a laboratory experiment or an astronomical phenomenon, that perception is not limited to one person. It is possible to see that event by a controlled experiment by anybody who has the facility to create that experimental apparatus, or if he has the astronomical telescope with him, he can observe it. Now, with religion, it happens mostly that a select few, or who are called the chosen few, are given this whatever you call vision or some particular experience, and the others have to go by their account of what they saw or what illumination they got. They can't expect to have the same illumination themselves.
Well, one might argue that religions prescribe certain techniques that lead to a certain state, which is sort of articulated and described. So if I follow a particular sadhana, I'm assured that I will experience, well, let's just say nirvana. And no matter how we verbally describe nirvana, we say it's a non-conceptual experience, so it can't be described in words. But if you do the following techniques and practices over a period of time with this motivation, you will get this experience. Now that seems to be a fairly empirical, logical process. Just as I need to go through certain processes, experiments and procedures in science to arrive at certain conclusions. So
I think up to the limit you have described, yes, it looks like that. But when you ask how many people have, for example, reached the level which Buddha reached, the kind of enlightenment, you will find you can't think of anybody else. So although the teachings are there and how to meditate, everything must be prescribed, but you find that that level is not attained. And similarly, other religions, you have Jnaneshwar in Maharashtra. He had attained a certain level of enlightenment, which he tried to communicate to others. And it's certainly whatever he taught or the teachings have been beneficial to the society. But the level which he himself attained could not be attained by the common man. In science, it is not like that. It is, if you do an experiment, like Millikan's experiment, oil drop experiment, which measured the electronic charge of the electron. Now, when it was first done, of course, it was very important, and one would call a Nobel Prize kind of experiment. But then now it is done in any laboratory at MSc level in a university. So it's a repeatable experiment.
Would you say that then the sort of exploration of religion begins where that of science ends?
I wouldn't put an end to science, but it covers areas which are so far not accessed by science. That would be a better description. Perhaps science may never access those areas, such as consciousness or the feeling of emotions, satisfaction, happiness. These are issues which science has still not quantified or kind of given a what I would call an experimental basis to. So you have it's sometimes said the one side of the head is logical and talks about scientific things, the other is more related to aesthetics and appreciation of the arts. So the human brain itself has these complementary facets built into it. So one should recognize that and say that there are two different
very
approaches.
often it may be our sort of Indian vanity, but we like to believe that modern physics validates many of the intuitive insights of our sages and seers from thousands of years ago. As a scientist, to what degree have you found these claims? Is this a myth? Is this credible?
Well, my approach is rather matter of fact to these issues. So I like to say that if some statement was made, let us try to put it in terms of number or quantitative details, and then we can check whether it works. So when you apply this technique, hardly anything is there for checking by science, because most of the ideas were qualitative, and in science you can go a certain distance by qualitative criteria, but then unless you take the next step on quantifying it, you don't get very far. One example, for instance, is gravitation. You can say the sun attracts the earth, and therefore the earth goes around the sun. But if you stop there, you have not made much progress. You have certainly made a factual statement, a significant one. But unless you say inverse square law and Kepler's laws of motion, they are all quantitative. Those details are not explained. Then you have not made sufficient progress in science.
But you know, at the sort of more obvious mundane level, the idea that our scriptures were able to predict flight, for example,
Yes.
Long before it really became real. Do you think that do you feel that we just dismiss that as an accident of history, or was there really something that?
Well, one can certainly give credit to the imagination of the person who wrote those descriptions, that even like this Brahmastra and various missiles, which are even guided missiles.
Right.
So all those descriptions are uncannily close to what present technology
So it was just
is.
vintage Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah, exactly. You put words in my mouth. That today I could write science fiction, which has something very futuristic, which is not there in our technology today. Later on, somebody reads that science fiction, he may think we did have that technology, but it is only the imagination of Arthur C. Clarke which has produced that.
Well, as someone who's been interested in Sanskrit from a child, and Sanskrit represents a lead-in to our heritage, and in some ways to the degree that language embodies culture, there is that close relationship between the two. What sort of parallels and what relevance and meaning do you find of that heritage in the contemporary world, where we seem to be moving increasingly towards an emphasis on the scientific, empirical age?
Well, it is hard to again quantify, but I find that some of the philosophies that are described are very useful, very relevant to the present day environment or the way we live life. Science tends to make us very down to earth, and we want to achieve this, we want to achieve that, so you use science and technology to produce that. But you move away from what is called a mental state of the person, and whether we are getting mental satisfaction of doing this. It's only physical satisfaction that science and technology provide. And I feel that some of the thoughts described in our heritage, Sanskrit heritage, are very important, relevant.
Which of these are important and relevant to you personally?
Well, I find that this philosophy of karma yoga, that is, you do your daily routine, or you do your whatever work you do not expect a reward for it. That is, you do it with a certain amount of detachment, but you do it sincerely. It is not that you are not interested in doing it, somebody has thrust it on you. That is not the case. You do it, but don't be so attached to it that if it does not come out, you get frustrated, or if you don't get rewarded for it, you get frustrated.
Doesn't that seem almost logical, scientific, what you're describing?
Yes, it is certainly, it has its own logic, but I think it is telling you something about how to live life.
But in a logical way, that I think karma is explained logically as cause and effect, which is from the vocabulary of science.
So, but I would not disqualify something as outside science just because it happens to be logical. You know, philosophers can be logical.
You know, as a you know, as a cosmologist, when you know, you sort of sit down and you look at the stars, what do you see? You know, we just say sort of, you know, lights in the sky, and we wonder if there are human beings or beings there, is there intelligence that peers down to us. But with all the sort of, you know, study and intellectual processes and intuitive processes that you have been through, thinking about the universe, what's the spontaneous thought when you look up at the sky? What happens to you?
Well, my reply is probably not spontaneous, but I will try to explain. One thing that my subject has taught me is that what you see out there is not the entirety. Our eyes are very poor receivers of information or interpreters of information. So with telescopes you find that much more exists which you can't see. So when you see the stars, at least when I see the stars, I find that those dark spaces are filled with interstellar gas. There are molecules in it. So the idea comes to my mind that out there somewhere the basic building blocks of life are floating. And there is evidence for it that complex organic molecules are present in molecular clouds which you don't see with naked eyes. And one wonders whether life either in our form or more advanced form exists. And then we again it sort of reduces you to your kind of isolation, that you are here on tiny planet and the vast world is there. Maybe life is it's full of life, but you are not in touch with it.
So what is your sort of aspiration in terms of your quest as a scientist?
Perhaps it is still very limited in terms of what is there. That being a cosmologist, I would like to have better understanding of the large scale structure of the universe.
How what is it that you feel you'd really like to know?
Yeah, I would well, I would like to know, for example, whether the universe existed say 15, 20 billion years ago, because I feel it will answer a lot of questions. It will not certainly close the book of cosmology. But if I, for example, find stars which are 50 billion years old, and I have a way of suggesting, looking for such stars. If such stars are found, I think it will explain a lot in terms of our universe, that the Big Bang origin cannot be consistent with such a finding. So I would be interested in finding how old the universe really is. And I may not get the answer in my lifetime, but this is the hope.
Does the scientific temper make you pessimistic or optimistic?
Of what?
Of the future, of the state of affairs, of being, of the future of mankind. Because when you look at it empirically, at one level, you look at the degradation of the environment, you see conflict and war, there is despair. But equally, if you look at it empirically, it can also evoke the faith that man will find solutions to his problems, that he will colonize the moon and colonize Mars, and man will survive.
Pollute the moon. No, I do sometimes despair for the following reason, that man calls himself a rational animal, but many times the rationality is not shown in the action. And you find, for example, even though you know the answers to many questions, scientifically demonstrated answers, you still continue to believe in the wrong hypothesis. So this kind of belief is against the scientific temper. And when you find educated people believing in such hypotheses which are outdated or which have been debunked, I begin to despair as to, with so much science around you, you are still immune from it.
And for which there is no logical scientific explanation either as to why a logical, scientifically educated person should think in that
Then
manner.
the second point is, as you mentioned, the unrestricted use of scientific inventions, that is unrestricted, meaning you don't look at it in a holistic manner. So you produce an invention, it works, you are happy, it has satisfied your requirement, but the side effects it has generated in the terms of degrading the environment, those are not dealt with by the person who made that invention. So such holistic ways of looking are very much needed.
Well, that is perhaps why we need God. Thank you very much, Dr. Narlikar. It's been a great privilege.
Thank you.